Marcus Williams adjusted his dress uniform one final time before stepping out of his car. The morning sun cast long shadows across the courthouse steps, and despite the warmth of the day, he felt a chill run down his spine. After 12 years serving his country as a Navy SEAL, completing 4 tours in Afghanistan and Iraq, Marcus never imagined he would be fighting a different kind of battle on American soil. The incident that brought him here seemed almost surreal now. 3 months ago, Marcus had been driving home from his daughter's school play when Officer Bradley Harrison pulled him over on Maple Street. What should have been a routine traffic stop escalated into something far more sinister. Harrison claimed Marcus was speeding, though Marcus knew he had been driving exactly at the speed limit, mindful of the school zone he had just passed through. Marcus remembered the way Harrison's eyes had narrowed when he saw Marcus's military ID alongside his driver's license. Instead of the respect most officers showed to service members, Harrison's expression had twisted into something uglier. The officer had ordered Marcus out of the vehicle, claiming he smelled marijuana, which was impossible since Marcus had never touched drugs in his life. The military's strict policies had made sure of that. What happened next still made Marcus's blood boil. Harrison had forced him to his knees on the asphalt, pressing his knee into Marcus's back while searching his pristine Honda Accord. The veteran's neighbors had begun gathering, recording everything on their phones. Mrs. Peterson, an elderly white woman who had known Marcus since he moved to the neighborhood 5 years ago, had shouted from her porch that Marcus was a decorated war hero and a good man. Harrison had ignored her completely. He spent 45 minutes tearing apart Marcus's car, removing seats, emptying the glove compartment, even checking inside the spare tire. When he found nothing, his frustration became palpable. That's when he claimed to find a small bag of what he insisted was cocaine in the driver's side door panel. Marcus knew it was impossible. His car had been detailed just days before, and he had never seen that bag in his life. The arrest had been humiliating. Harrison had made sure to use excessive force, slamming Marcus against the patrol car hard enough to leave bruises on his ribs. The handcuffs were tightened beyond necessity, cutting into his wrists. As they drove to the station, Harrison had made comments that left no doubt about his motivations. He spoke about how people like Marcus thought they were better than everyone else just because they wore a uniform, how military service didn't make someone special, and how he was tired of these troublemakers moving into decent neighborhoods. Marcus's wife, Sarah, had been devastated when she received the call. A nurse at the local hospital, she was well respected in their community. Their 2 children, Emma, age 10, and David, age 7, couldn't understand why their father, their hero, was being treated like a criminal. The local news had picked up the story quickly, especially after the neighbors' videos went viral on social media. The evidence against Harrison's version of events was overwhelming. 3 different cell phone videos showed the officer's aggressive behavior and the suspicious circumstances surrounding the alleged drug discovery. The bag itself seemed to appear from nowhere, and forensic analysis would later reveal that it contained a substance that wasn't even cocaine, but rather a common household cleaning powder that someone had placed in a small plastic baggie. Community leaders rallied around Marcus immediately. Pastor Williams from the First Baptist Church organized prayer vigils, while the local NAACP chapter provided legal support. Veterans organizations expressed outrage that a decorated serviceman was being treated this way. The American Legion Post, where Marcus was a member, issued a statement condemning Officer Harrison's actions and demanding a thorough investigation. Marcus's military record spoke for itself. Bronze Star recipient, Purple Heart for injuries sustained in combat, commendations for leadership and bravery under fire. His commanding officers described him as one of the most reliable and honorable soldiers they had ever known. His security clearance was at the highest levels, requiring extensive background checks that would have revealed any criminal tendencies or drug use. The legal team Sarah had hired was led by attorney Jennifer Martinez, a civil rights lawyer with experience in police misconduct cases. She immediately recognized the pattern of behavior and began investigating Harrison's history. What she found was disturbing. Over his 8-year career, Harrison had been involved in 17 excessive force complaints, with 15 of those involving Black or Hispanic suspects. Internal affairs had repeatedly cleared him, but the pattern was undeniable. Martinez discovered that Harrison had connections to several online groups that promoted white supremacist ideologies. His social media accounts, which he thought were private, contained racist memes and comments about minorities in the military and law enforcement. Screenshots of his posts had been preserved by investigative journalists who were building a case about systemic racism in the police department. The prosecutor assigned to Marcus's case, District Attorney Robert Chen, initially seemed reluctant to drop the charges. Chen had a reputation for being tough on crime and supporting law enforcement. However, as more evidence emerged about Harrison's background and the circumstances of the arrest, public pressure mounted. The mayor's office received hundreds of calls demanding justice for Marcus Williams. Marcus's employer, a defense contractor where he worked as a security consultant, stood by him throughout the ordeal. His colleagues, many of them fellow veterans, organized fundraisers to help with legal expenses. The company's CEO, a former Marine, issued a public statement supporting Marcus and condemning what he called a clear case of racial profiling and evidence tampering. As the court date approached, Marcus found himself struggling with emotions he hadn't felt since combat. The hypervigilance, the anger, the sense of injustice all reminded him of fighting an enemy overseas. But this enemy wore an American uniform and had sworn to protect and serve the same community Marcus had defended with his life in foreign lands. Sarah watched her husband grapple with the situation, seeing how it affected his sleep and his relationship with their children. Emma had started asking difficult questions about why police officers, who she had always been taught to trust, would hurt her daddy. David had become clingy, afraid that his father might be taken away again. The night before the court hearing, Marcus sat in his backyard looking at the American flag he flew proudly every day. He thought about his fallen comrades who had died believing in the principles of justice and equality that flag represented. Tomorrow he would find out whether those principles still held true in his own hometown courtroom. The weight of representing not just himself, but every service member who had faced discrimination, pressed heavily on his shoulders as he prepared for what might be the most important battle of his life. The courthouse lobby buzzed with activity as Marcus Williams walked through the metal detectors. News crews had gathered outside and reporters shouted questions that he ignored. His attorney, Jennifer Martinez, met him at the security checkpoint, her expression serious but confident. She had spent weeks preparing for this moment, gathering evidence that would expose the truth about Officer Bradley Harrison. Judge Patricia Morrison presided over courtroom 3B, known for her no-nonsense approach and reputation for fairness. At 62, she had seen every type of case imaginable during her 20-year tenure on the bench. Her silver hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and her sharp eyes missed nothing as the courtroom filled with spectators, reporters, and supporters from both sides. The prosecution table looked surprisingly sparse. District Attorney Robert Chen had assigned Assistant District Attorney Michael Foster to handle the case, a young prosecutor who seemed uncomfortable with the assignment. Foster shuffled through his papers nervously, occasionally glancing at Officer Harrison, who sat rigid in his uniform, his jaw clenched tight. Harrison's appearance was meticulously crafted to project authority and credibility. His uniform was pressed to perfection, his shoes gleamed, and his posture screamed military precision, though he had never served in the armed forces. At 34, he carried himself with an arrogance that many of his colleagues had noticed, but few had challenged. His attorney, Dennis Walsh, was a veteran police union lawyer, known for getting officers out of difficult situations. The gallery was packed with supporters for Marcus. His wife Sarah sat in the front row, flanked by his children Emma and David. Behind them were dozens of fellow veterans, church members, and community leaders. The diversity of the crowd was striking. Black and white faces united in support of a man they knew to be honorable. Several wore military pins or carried small American flags. On the other side, a smaller group of police officers occupied 2 rows, their presence meant to show solidarity with Harrison. But even among them, there were uncomfortable glances and whispered conversations. Not everyone in the department supported Harrison, especially after recent revelations about his online activities. As Judge Morrison called the court to order, the tension was palpable. She reviewed the charges against Marcus, possession of a controlled substance and resisting arrest, then looked directly at Ada Foster. Her expression suggested she had already reviewed the case file thoroughly and had formed some preliminary opinions about its merit. Foster stood to deliver his opening statement. but his usual confidence seemed shaken. He outlined the prosecution's case, describing how Officer Harrison had conducted a routine traffic stop that led to the discovery of cocaine in Marcus Williams's vehicle. But his voice lacked conviction, and he stumbled over several phrases, particularly when describing the circumstances of the drug discovery. When Jennifer Martinez rose for the defense opening, the atmosphere in the courtroom shifted. She was known for her passionate advocacy and meticulous preparation. Her voice carried clearly as she promised to show that Marcus Williams was the victim of a racist officer who had planted evidence and abused his power. She outlined Harrison's history of complaints, his online activities, and the suspicious circumstances surrounding the alleged drug discovery. The first witness called was Officer Harrison himself. Walsh had advised him to testify early, hoping to establish credibility before the defense could undermine his story. Harrison took the oath with his right hand raised high, his voice strong and clear as he swore to tell the truth. Under direct examination, Harrison recounted his version of events. He claimed he had pulled Marcus over for speeding through a school zone, a serious safety violation. When he approached the vehicle, he said, he detected the strong odor of marijuana. This gave him probable cause to search the vehicle, during which he discovered the bag of cocaine hidden in the driver's side door panel. Harrison described Marcus as belligerent and uncooperative, claiming the veteran had refused to follow commands and had to be forcibly restrained. He painted himself as a professional officer simply doing his job, protecting the community from dangerous criminals who thought their military service put them above the law. But as Martinez began her cross-examination, cracks in Harrison's story quickly appeared. She started by asking about his training in drug detection, forcing him to admit he had no specialized certification in identifying marijuana odors. When she asked about the timeline of the search, Harrison's answers became inconsistent with his initial report. Martinez then introduced the cell phone videos taken by neighbors. The courtroom watched in silence as the footage played on large monitors. The videos clearly showed Marcus complying with all commands, remaining calm and respectful throughout the encounter. There was no evidence of the belligerent behavior Harrison had described. More damaging was what the videos revealed about the drug discovery. In one clear shot, Harrison could be seen reaching into his own pocket before claiming to find the bag in Marcus's car door panel. The timing was suspicious, and Martinez pressed Harrison about this detail. His explanations became more convoluted as he tried to maintain his story. The attorney then produced Harrison's social media records, which had been obtained through a court order. The courtroom gasped as she read several of his posts aloud. One particularly damning message from 2 months before Marcus's arrest read, "These military types think they're heroes, but they're just government tools. Someone needs to show them they bleed like everyone else." Another post, accompanied by a racist meme, complained about affirmative action soldiers who didn't deserve their positions. Harrison's face reddened as Martinez read post after post revealing his bias against minorities and veterans. Walsh objected repeatedly, but Judge Morrison allowed the evidence, noting its relevance to establishing motive and bias. The cross-examination continued for nearly 2 hours. Martinez methodically destroyed Harrison's credibility, pointing out inconsistencies in his testimony, questioning his motivations, and exposing his prejudices. By the time she finished, Harrison was sweating visibly. His earlier confidence completely evaporated. The prosecution's case was already in serious trouble, but Martinez wasn't finished. She called Dr. Patricia Kim, a forensic scientist who had analyzed the bag allegedly found in Marcus's car. Dr. Kim testified that the substance was not cocaine, but rather a mixture of cornstarch and baking soda, consistent with a homemade substitute someone might use to frame another person. More importantly, Dr. Kim revealed that fingerprint analysis of the bag showed only Officer Harrison's prints, with no trace evidence linking it to Marcus or his vehicle. The courtroom erupted in murmurs as the implications became clear. Judge Morrison gavelled for order, but the damage to the prosecution's case was devastating. ADA Foster's redirect examination of Harrison was brief and ineffective. The officer's credibility was thoroughly destroyed, and Walsh's attempts to rehabilitate his client only seemed to make things worse. Harrison's explanations for the forensic evidence were implausible, and his demeanor had shifted from confident to defensive. As the morning session concluded, Marcus felt a surge of hope for the first time since his arrest. The truth was finally coming out, and the systematic racism that had targeted him was being exposed in open court. But he knew the fight wasn't over yet, and Officer Harrison still had allies who might try to salvage the case against him. During the lunch recess, the courthouse hallways buzzed with intense conversations. News reporters cornered anyone willing to speak, while supporters of both sides retreated to separate corners of the building. Marcus Williams stood with his family in a small conference room, finally allowing himself to believe that justice might prevail. Sarah squeezed her husband's hand as they reviewed the morning's proceedings with Jennifer Martinez. The attorney was pleased with the progress but warned them not to celebrate yet. She explained that the prosecution might try to salvage their case by arguing that Harrison's personal biases didn't necessarily prove he had planted evidence, despite how suspicious the circumstances appeared. Meanwhile, Ada Foster huddled with his supervisor, District Attorney Robert Chen, who had arrived during the lunch break after watching news coverage of the morning session. Chen's political instincts told him this case was becoming a disaster that could damage his reputation and his office's relationship with the community. He instructed Foster to be prepared for damage control. Officer Harrison sat alone at the prosecution table, his earlier confidence completely shattered. His attorney Dennis Walsh tried to prepare him for what was coming, but both men knew the afternoon would bring more devastating testimony. Several of Harrison's fellow officers had distanced themselves from him as the evidence mounted, and the police union was quietly considering whether to continue their support. Judge Morrison reconvened court at exactly 1:30 p.m., her expression stern as she surveyed the packed courtroom. The afternoon session would focus on character witnesses and expert testimony, crucial elements that could definitively establish Marcus Williams' innocence and Officer Harrison's misconduct. Martinez called her next witness, Colonel James Richardson, Marcus Williams's former commanding officer. The decorated Marine officer entered the courtroom in full dress uniform, his bearing commanding immediate respect from everyone present. His 25 years of military service included 3 combat deployments and numerous commendations for leadership and integrity. Colonel Richardson's testimony was powerful and unwavering. He described Marcus as one of the finest soldiers he had ever commanded, emphasizing his absolute integrity and dedication to duty. The colonel explained the extensive security clearance requirements for Navy SEALs, noting that any criminal behavior or drug use would have immediately disqualified Marcus from his position. Under oath, Richardson testified that Marcus had access to classified information at the highest levels, requiring annual polygraph examinations and continuous monitoring. The idea that such a person would risk everything for illegal drugs was not just unlikely, but impossible, given the constant scrutiny military personnel face. His words carried tremendous weight with the jury and spectators alike. The colonel also addressed Marcus's character during combat operations, describing instances where he had risked his own life to save civilian lives and protect fellow soldiers. He spoke of Marcus's leadership during a particularly dangerous mission in Afghanistan where he had single-handedly neutralized 3 enemy positions to protect his unit and local villagers caught in crossfire. When Dennis Walsh cross-examined Colonel Richardson, the defense attorney's attempts to undermine the military officer's testimony fell flat. Walsh suggested that military personnel sometimes engaged in illegal activities despite their training, but Richardson's response was swift and definitive. He explained the military's zero-tolerance policy and the career-ending consequences of any criminal behavior. Next, Martinez called Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a psychiatrist who specialized in treating veterans with PTSD and had evaluated Marcus after his arrest. Dr. Mitchell explained that Marcus showed no signs of substance abuse or the behavioral patterns typically associated with drug users. Instead, she found him to be suffering from stress-related symptoms directly caused by his unjust arrest and prosecution. Dr. Mitchell's testimony revealed the psychological impact Harrison's actions had on Marcus and his family. She described how the incident had triggered combat-related stress responses, not because of guilt or fear of prosecution, but because of the injustice and betrayal he felt from being targeted by someone sworn to protect and serve. The psychiatrist also addressed the broader implications of racial profiling on veterans of color, explaining how Marcus's case fit a disturbing pattern of discrimination that undermined trust in law enforcement and damaged community relations. Her professional analysis provided scientific backing for what many in the courtroom already believed about Harrison's motivations. ADA Foster's cross-examination of Dr. Mitchell was brief and ineffective. He couldn't challenge her professional credentials or her findings without appearing to question the legitimacy of PTSD, which would have been politically and ethically problematic. Martinez then called Mrs. Eleanor Peterson, the elderly neighbor who had witnessed and recorded Harrison's treatment of Marcus. At 78, Mrs. Peterson was a retired schoolteacher whose word carried considerable weight in the community. She had taught 3 generations of local families and was known for her honesty and keen observation skills. Mrs. Peterson's testimony was devastating to Harrison's credibility. She described watching from her front porch as the traffic stop unfolded, noting that Marcus had been completely compliant and respectful throughout the encounter. She testified that she had never seen Marcus behave in any way that would suggest drug use or criminal activity. More importantly, Mrs. Peterson confirmed what the video evidence had suggested about the drug discovery. She had a clear view of Harrison's actions and testified that she saw him take something from his own pocket before claiming to find it in Marcus's car. Her eyewitness account corroborated the video evidence and provided additional credibility to the defense's case. During cross-examination, Walsh attempted to suggest that Mrs. Peterson's age might have affected her memory or perception, but his questions backfired. The elderly woman's responses were sharp and detailed, demonstrating perfect recall of events. Her testimony actually became more damaging to Harrison as she provided additional details about his aggressive behavior and suspicious actions. The prosecution's case continued to unravel as Martinez called Detective Lisa Rodriguez, an internal affairs investigator who had been examining complaints against Harrison. Detective Rodriguez testified about the pattern of excessive force complaints in Harrison's file, noting that 15 of 17 incidents involved minorities and that several complainants had mentioned racist comments. Rodriguez revealed that her investigation had uncovered Harrison's involvement with online hate groups and his pattern of targeting minority drivers in traffic stops. Statistical analysis showed that Harrison stopped Black and Hispanic drivers at rates significantly higher than other officers in his precinct, despite working the same areas and shifts. The detective also testified about evidence tampering in other cases involving Harrison, suggesting that Marcus Williams might not be the first person to be framed by the corrupt officer. Her testimony painted a picture of systemic misconduct that had been ignored by supervisors for too long. As the afternoon progressed, it became clear that the prosecution's case was not just weak, but completely undermined by the evidence. Ada Foster made several attempts to object to testimony or limit the scope of questioning, but Judge Morrison consistently ruled in favor of allowing the evidence. The final witness of the day was Marcus Williams himself. Martinez had saved his testimony for last, allowing him to address the court after all the supporting evidence had been presented. Marcus took the stand with the same dignity and composure he had shown throughout the ordeal. Under direct examination, Marcus calmly recounted the events of that day, his voice steady despite the emotional weight of reliving the experience. He described his shock at being treated like a criminal, his confusion at Harrison's aggressive behavior, and his devastation at being arrested in front of his neighbors and community. Marcus's testimony was particularly powerful when he addressed the impact on his children, who had struggled to understand why their hero father was being treated as a criminal. His voice broke slightly as he described having to explain racism and injustice to his young daughter and son, concepts he had hoped they wouldn't have to confront for many years. As the day concluded, the courtroom was filled with a sense that justice was finally being served, but everyone knew that Officer Harrison and his supporters weren't finished fighting. The tension in the courtroom was electric as Dennis Walsh began his cross-examination of Marcus Williams. The police union attorney knew this was his last chance to salvage what had become a disastrous case for his client. Walsh had built his career defending officers in difficult situations, but the evidence against Harrison was overwhelming. Walsh started aggressively, questioning Marcus about his military service and suggesting that combat veterans sometimes struggled with authority figures and civilian law enforcement. He implied that Marcus's PTSD might have caused him to misremember or misinterpret Harrison's actions during the traffic stop. But Marcus remained calm and composed, his military training evident in his measured responses. He acknowledged his combat service and the challenges veterans face, but firmly denied any memory problems or issues with authority. His answers were direct and honest, showing none of the defensive behavior Walsh was hoping to provoke. When Walsh suggested that Marcus might have been under the influence of something that didn't show up in standard drug tests, Jennifer Martinez objected strongly. Judge Morrison sustained the objection, noting that there was no evidence whatsoever to support such speculation. Walsh's fishing expedition was making him look desperate and was actually strengthening Marcus's credibility. The attorney then tried a different approach, questioning Marcus about his interactions with police officers in the past. He seemed to be building toward suggesting a pattern of conflict with law enforcement, but Marcus's responses demolished this strategy. Marcus testified about positive interactions with officers, including those who had provided security at military events and worked with veterans organizations. Walsh's cross-examination became increasingly frustrated as Marcus answered every question with dignity and clarity. The veteran's composure under hostile questioning demonstrated exactly the kind of character his supporters had described. By the time Walsh concluded his examination, he had succeeded only in making Marcus appear more credible and sympathetic. During redirect examination, Martinez allowed Marcus to elaborate on several points Walsh had raised. Marcus spoke movingly about his service to his country and his commitment to justice and equality, values he had risked his life to defend overseas. He expressed his disappointment that he was being forced to fight for those same values in an American courtroom. As Marcus stepped down from the witness stand, the courtroom was completely silent. Even some of the police officers who had come to support Harrison appeared moved by his testimony. The contrast between Marcus's dignified bearing and Harrison's earlier defensive performance could not have been more stark. ADA Foster then began the prosecution's rebuttal case, but he had little to work with. His first witness was Sergeant Mike Thompson, Harrison's patrol supervisor, who testified about the officer's training and experience. But under cross-examination, Martinez revealed that Thompson had failed to properly investigate numerous complaints against Harrison and had ignored warning signs of misconduct. Thompson's testimony actually helped the defense case when he admitted under questioning that he had never seen Harrison's social media posts and had never conducted any meaningful review of his pattern of stops and arrests. The supervisor's negligence in overseeing Harrison became another indictment of the systemic problems in the police department. The prosecution's final witness was Officer Janet Mills, Harrison's partner on several occasions, who testified about his professionalism and dedication, but Mills had not been present during Marcus's arrest, and her general character testimony seemed hollow in light of the overwhelming evidence of Harrison's misconduct and bias. During cross-examination, Martinez established that Mills had never worked closely with Harrison on cases involving minority suspects and was unaware of his online activities or controversial statements. Her testimony seemed to confirm that Harrison had been careful to hide his true beliefs from colleagues who might report his behavior. As the evidentiary portion of the trial concluded, both sides prepared for closing arguments. The courtroom remained packed, with many spectators having stayed throughout the entire proceedings. The media coverage had intensified, with national news outlets picking up the story and civil rights organizations expressing support for Marcus. A.D. Foster delivered the prosecution's closing argument first, but his heart clearly wasn't in it. He went through the motions of arguing that the evidence showed Marcus had been in possession of illegal drugs and had resisted arrest, but his presentation lacked conviction. The prosecutor seemed more interested in getting through his obligations than in securing a conviction. Foster's argument was particularly weak when addressing the forensic evidence and Harrison's credibility problems. He asked the jury to ignore the officer's social media posts and focus only on his testimony, but this request seemed unrealistic, given the overwhelming evidence of bias and misconduct. When Jennifer Martinez rose for the defense closing, the atmosphere in the courtroom shifted dramatically. She began by thanking the jury for their attention and patience, then launched into a passionate defense of her client and an indictment of the injustice he had suffered. Martinez systematically destroyed every element of the prosecution's case. Starting with the suspicious circumstances of the traffic stop, she pointed out that Harrison's claim about detecting marijuana odors was unsupported by any evidence, and that his search of the vehicle was conducted without proper justification. The attorney then addressed the planted evidence, walking the jury through the timeline, and evidence that proved Harrison had fabricated the drug discovery. She highlighted the forensic evidence showing only Harrison's fingerprints on the bag, the video evidence of his suspicious behavior, and Mrs. Peterson's eyewitness testimony, confirming that Harrison had taken something from his own pocket. Martinez spent considerable time discussing Harrison's history of complaints and his documented bias against minorities and veterans. She argued that this wasn't just a case of police misconduct, but a deliberate act of racial targeting by an officer with a documented pattern of discriminatory behavior. The defense attorney's voice rose with emotion as she described the impact of Harrison's actions on Marcus and his family. She spoke about the children who no longer trusted police officers, the veteran who had served his country with distinction, only to be betrayed by someone sworn to protect and serve, and the community that had lost faith in law enforcement. Martinez concluded by challenging the jury to send a message that racial profiling and evidence tampering would not be tolerated in their community. She reminded them that Marcus Williams had risked his life defending the principles of justice and equality that were now being tested in their courtroom. The prosecutor's rebuttal was brief and half-hearted. Foster seemed to recognize that his case was hopeless and made only a token effort to address the defense arguments. His presentation was so weak that several jury members appeared to be paying more attention to the courtroom spectators than to his closing remarks. Judge Morrison then instructed the jury on the law, explaining the burden of proof and the elements of each charge. Her instructions were thorough and fair, but they seemed almost unnecessary given the strength of the evidence in Marcus's favor. The jury retired to deliberate at 4:30 p.m., with most courtroom observers expecting a quick verdict. As the jury deliberated, supporters gathered in the courthouse lobby to await the verdict. Marcus sat quietly with his family, finally allowing himself to believe that his nightmare might soon be over. The evidence had been overwhelming, the testimony compelling, and justice seemed within reach. But everyone knew that jury verdicts could be unpredictable, and Officer Harrison still had defenders who believed police officers deserved support regardless of the circumstances. The next few hours would determine whether truth and justice would prevail over prejudice and institutional protection of corrupt officers. The jury deliberated for only 90 minutes before sending word that they had reached a verdict. The speed of their decision surprised no one who had witnessed the overwhelming evidence presented during the trial. As word spread through the courthouse, supporters of both sides rushed back to courtroom 3B for the announcement that would determine Marcus Williams's fate. Judge Morrison called the court to order as the 12 jurors filed back into their seats. The forewoman, a middle-aged school administrator named Patricia Evans, held the verdict form with steady hands. Her expression was solemn but determined, giving no hint of the decision they had reached after their brief deliberations. Marcus Williams stood between his attorneys, his military bearing evident despite the emotional toll of the past few months. Sarah sat directly behind him with their children, her hand gripping the wooden rail that separated the gallery from the attorney tables. The tension in the room was almost unbearable as everyone waited for the words that would either vindicate Marcus or send him to prison. Officer Harrison sat rigidly at the prosecution table, his face pale but defiant. Dennis Walsh had advised him to prepare for the possibility of acquittal, but Harrison's arrogance had prevented him from truly accepting that his testimony might not be believed. The corrupt officer still believed his badge and uniform gave him credibility that civilians couldn't challenge. Judge Morrison asked the forewoman if the jury had reached a verdict on all charges. Evans confirmed they had, then began reading the decisions that would change multiple lives forever. The courtroom was so quiet that the air conditioning system seemed deafeningly loud as everyone held their breath. On the charge of possession of a controlled substance, the jury found Marcus Williams not guilty. The words rang through the courtroom like a bell, causing immediate reactions throughout the gallery. Marcus's supporters erupted in cheers and applause while Judge Morrison gavelled for order. Sarah Williams began crying tears of relief, pulling her children close as they celebrated their father's vindication. On the charge of resisting arrest, the jury again found Marcus Williams not guilty. This second acquittal was even more significant because it directly contradicted Harrison's testimony about Marcus's behavior during the traffic stop. The jury had clearly believed the video evidence and witness testimony over the corrupt officer's lies. As the verdicts were read, Harrison's face turned red with anger and humiliation. He had expected the civilian jury to automatically believe a police officer's word, and the complete rejection of his testimony was a devastating blow to his ego and his future career prospects. His attorney placed a restraining hand on his arm as Harrison started to rise from his chair. Judge Morrison thanked the jury for their service and dismissed them. But several jurors remained in the courtroom to congratulate Marcus and his family. Patricia Evans, the forewoman, approached Marcus personally to tell him that the jury had never doubted his innocence and that they were outraged by Officer Harrison's conduct. The celebration in the courtroom was emotional and heartfelt. Colonel Richardson, who had flown in specifically for the verdict, embraced Marcus with tears in his eyes. Fellow veterans who had supported Marcus throughout the ordeal surrounded him, their pride in their brother-in-arms evident in their faces and words. But the victory in court was only the beginning of the consequences for Officer Harrison. As the courtroom emptied, Detective Lisa Rodriguez approached Ada Foster to discuss the criminal charges that would now be filed against Harrison for evidence tampering, perjury, and civil rights violations. The corrupt officer's legal troubles were just beginning. District Attorney Robert Chen held an impromptu press conference on the courthouse steps, announcing that his office would immediately begin prosecuting Harrison for his crimes. Chen, who had initially been reluctant to drop the charges against Marcus, now positioned himself as a champion of justice, clearly recognizing the political winds had shifted dramatically. Chen announced that his office would conduct a comprehensive review of all cases involving Officer Harrison, particularly those involving minority defendants. He promised that any victims of Harrison's misconduct would receive justice and that the district attorney's office would work to restore community trust that had been damaged by this scandal. Jennifer Martinez also addressed the media, praising the jury's courage in holding a corrupt officer accountable. She announced that Marcus Williams would be filing federal civil rights lawsuits against Officer Harrison, the police department, and the city for the violation of his constitutional rights and the emotional distress caused to his family. The attorney revealed that they had been contacted by several other potential victims of Harrison's misconduct, including minorities and veterans who had been targeted by the corrupt officer in similar situations. She promised that each case would be thoroughly investigated and that pattern of discrimination would be exposed in federal court. Marcus Williams himself spoke briefly to the media, his words measured but powerful. He thanked the jury for seeing through Harrison's lies and recognizing the truth. He expressed his hope that his case would prevent other innocent people from being victimized by corrupt officers who abused their authority to target minorities. Most importantly, Marcus dedicated his victory to his fellow service members, particularly veterans of color who had faced discrimination despite their service to their country. He promised to use his platform to advocate for reform in law enforcement and to ensure that the principles he had fought for overseas would be protected at home. The police union's response was swift and predictable. Union President Carl Morrison issued a statement distancing the organization from Harrison and announcing that they would no longer provide legal support for his defense. The union's abandonment of Harrison signaled to other officers that racist conduct and evidence tampering would not be tolerated or protected. Police Chief Daniel Murphy held his own press conference, announcing Harrison's immediate suspension without pay pending the criminal charges. Murphy, who had initially supported Harrison, now condemned his actions and promised comprehensive reforms to prevent similar incidents in the future. The chief announced new policies requiring body cameras for all traffic stops, mandatory bias training for all officers, and an independent review board to investigate complaints of discrimination. He also promised to work with community leaders to rebuild trust that had been damaged by Harrison's actions and the department's initial failure to properly investigate complaints against him. Social media exploded with reactions to the verdict, with supporters of Marcus Williams celebrating the victory for justice, while critics of law enforcement pointed to the case as evidence of systemic problems that needed immediate attention. The hashtags, Justice for Marcus and NARS Accountability Matters, trended nationally as people shared their own experiences with police. Misconduct veterans organizations across the country issued statements praising the jury's decision and calling for better protection of service members from discrimination. The American Legion, Veterans of Foreign Wars, and Iraq and Afghanistan Veterans of America all condemned Harrison's actions and pledged support for Marcus Williams in his ongoing legal battles. Local community leaders organized a celebration rally in the park where Marcus often brought his children to play. Pastor Williams from First Baptist Church spoke about the power of truth and justice prevailing over hatred and corruption. The diverse crowd that gathered reflected the broad coalition that had supported Marcus throughout his ordeal. Emma and David Williams, who had struggled to understand why their father was being treated badly, could finally see their hero vindicated. Their teachers reported that both children seemed more confident and happy in the days following the verdict, no longer carrying the burden of confusion and fear that had marked their behavior during the trial. The verdict sent shockwaves through the police department, where officers were forced to confront the reality that one of their own had committed serious crimes while wearing the badge. Many good officers expressed relief that Harrison's corruption had been exposed, recognizing that his actions had damaged the reputation of all law enforcement personnel. Several officers came forward privately to report other incidents of misconduct they had witnessed from Harrison, providing investigators with additional evidence for the criminal case that would soon follow. The culture of silence that had protected Harrison for years was finally breaking down as officers recognized the consequences of failing to report wrongdoing. The FBI announced that they would be opening their own investigation into Harrison's civil rights violations, which could result in federal charges carrying much more serious penalties than the state charges he already faced. Federal prosecutors indicated that they were particularly interested in Harrison's connections to hate groups and his pattern of targeting minority citizens. As the immediate celebration died down, Marcus Williams and his family began the process of rebuilding their lives after months of uncertainty and stress. The financial burden of legal fees had been substantial, despite community support and fundraising efforts, but the civil rights lawsuit promised to provide compensation for their suffering. More importantly, Marcus found himself in a position. 6 months after his acquittal, Marcus Williams sat in the federal courthouse downtown, this time as a plaintiff rather than a defendant. The civil rights lawsuit against Officer Bradley Harrison, the police department, and the city had finally reached trial. The morning sun streamed through the tall windows as Marcus watched Harrison enter the courtroom in handcuffs. His fall from authority complete and devastating. Harrison's criminal trial had concluded 3 weeks earlier with guilty verdicts on all charges. Evidence tampering, perjury, deprivation of rights under color of law, and conspiracy had earned him a sentence of 8 years in federal prison. The corrupt officer who had once wielded his badge like a weapon now wore an orange jumpsuit and shackles, his arrogance replaced by the hollow look of a man who had lost everything. The civil trial was presided over by Judge Sarah Patterson, a federal judge known for her expertise in civil rights cases. Her courtroom had seen many battles over constitutional violations, but few cases had garnered as much public attention as Marcus Williams versus the city of Riverside and Officer Bradley Harrison. Jennifer Martinez had assembled a formidable legal team for the civil case, including specialists in police misconduct and constitutional law. They had spent months documenting not just Harrison's crimes against Marcus, but a pattern of systemic failures that had allowed the corrupt officer to operate with impunity for years. The city's defense team, led by Attorney General Rebecca Morrison, faced an almost impossible task. With Harrison's criminal convictions already established, they could not dispute that violations had occurred. Instead, they were forced to argue about damages and whether the city should be held responsible for one rogue officer's actions. During opening statements, Martinez painted a comprehensive picture of institutional failure that went far beyond Harrison's individual crimes. She presented evidence showing that supervisors had ignored complaints, that training was inadequate, and that the department's culture had enabled discrimination to flourish. Unchecked, the attorney revealed internal documents showing that Police Chief Daniel Murphy and his predecessors had received dozens of complaints, about Harrison over the years, yet no meaningful action had been taken. Performance reviews that should have raised red flags were whitewashed, and citizens who complained about Harrison's conduct were often ignored or intimidated. Martinez also introduced expert testimony from Dr. Angela Foster, a criminologist who specialized in police misconduct. Dr. Foster explained how departments that fail to address early warning signs of officer misconduct create environments where corruption and civil rights violations become inevitable. The key expert testified that Harrison's case was textbook example of how systemic failures enable individual officers to commit serious crimes. She pointed to the lack of supervision, inadequate training on implicit bias, absence of meaningful accountability measures, and a culture that prioritized protecting officers over serving the community. Marcus's testimony in the civil trial was even more powerful than it had been during the criminal case. With Harrison already convicted and imprisoned, Marcus could focus on the broader impact of the injustice he had suffered and the changes needed to prevent similar incidents. He spoke about the ongoing psychological effects of being targeted and framed by a police officer, describing nightmares and hypervigilance that reminded him of his combat experiences. But more importantly, Marcus testified about his determination to ensure that his ordeal would lead to meaningful reforms that would protect other citizens. Sarah Williams took the stand to describe the impact on their family, particularly their children's lost faith in law enforcement and their struggles to understand how someone sworn to protect and serve could deliberately harm their father. Her testimony about Emma and David's fears and confusion brought tears to the eyes of several jurors. The civil trial also featured testimony from other victims of Harrison's misconduct who had come forward after the criminal conviction. 3 other minority citizens described similar experiences of being targeted, harassed, and in one case, having evidence planted during traffic stops. Maria Santos, a Hispanic nurse, testified that Harrison had stopped her 6 times in 2 years, always finding pretexts to search her car and question her right to be in certain neighborhoods. Her testimony revealed that Harrison's targeting of Marcus was part of a much broader pattern of discrimination. James Washington, an African-American teacher, described being pulled over by Harrison after leaving a school board meeting, where he had advocated for better funding for predominantly minority schools. Harrison had arrested him for disorderly conduct after Washington questioned the basis for the stop, charges that were later dropped, but not before damaging his reputation in the community. The most damaging testimony came from former Police Sergeant Linda Chen, who had been transferred to another department after clashing with supervisors over Harrison's conduct. Chen testified that she had repeatedly tried to raise concerns about Harrison's behavior but was told to mind her own business and focus on her own duties. Chen revealed that she had documented several incidents where Harrison's reports didn't match what she had observed, but her attempts to investigate were blocked by supervisors who seemed more interested in protecting the department's image than addressing misconduct. The former sergeant's testimony was particularly powerful because it came from someone within law enforcement who had tried to do the right thing but was silenced by a corrupt system. Her courage in speaking out despite facing retaliation in her career demonstrated the institutional problems that had enabled Harrison's crimes. Expert witnesses testified about the financial and social costs of police misconduct, not just to individual victims like Marcus, but to entire communities that lost trust in law enforcement. Dr. Michael Roberts, an economist, calculated the costs of Harrison's misconduct in terms of lost productivity, medical expenses, legal fees, and damage to community relations. The city's defense focused primarily on arguing that Harrison was a rogue officer whose actions couldn't have been predicted or prevented. They claimed that the department had followed proper procedures and that individual officers must be held responsible for their own criminal choices. However, this defense crumbled under the weight of evidence showing systemic failures. Internal documents revealed that multiple supervisors had been aware of problems with Harrison but had chosen to ignore or cover them up rather than address them properly. The jury deliberated for 2 days before returning with a verdict that sent shockwaves through law enforcement communities across the country. They awarded Marcus Williams $12 million in compensatory and punitive damages, one of the largest civil rights settlements in the state's history. More importantly, The jury's verdict included specific findings that the city and police department had violated Marcus's constitutional rights through deliberate indifference to Harrison's pattern of misconduct. These findings would provide legal precedent for future cases and force departments nationwide to take early warning signs more seriously. Judge Patterson praised the jury's careful consideration of the evidence and their recognition that institutional accountability was necessary to prevent future violations. She noted that the size of the award reflected not just the harm done to Marcus Williams, but the need to send a message that civil rights violations would carry serious financial consequences. The verdict prompted immediate changes in the Riverside Police Department and similar departments across the country. New policies requiring body cameras, mandatory bias training, independent oversight, and swift investigation of complaints became standard practice as departments sought to avoid similar lawsuits. Marcus Williams used his platform and settlement to establish the Veterans Justice Foundation, an organization dedicated to protecting service members from discrimination and ensuring that those who served their country overseas would be treated with dignity and respect at home. As Marcus left the federal courthouse for the final time, he reflected on the long journey from that terrible day when Harrison had targeted him to this moment of complete vindication. The fight had been difficult and painful, but it had ultimately strengthened his faith in justice and his determination to make his country live up to its highest ideals. Standing with his family on the courthouse steps, surrounded by supporters and media, Marcus Williams had transformed from victim to advocate, ensuring that his experience would lead to lasting change that would protect countless others from the discrimination and injustice he had endured.